On the morning of April 3rd, 1882, a single bullet ended the life of America's most wanted outlaw and created a legend that would outlive the truth for generations. The man who fell that day in a modest house in St. Joseph, Missouri, was not the heroic Robin Hood of folklore, nor was he the demonic villain portrayed by his enemies. Jesse Woodson James was something far more complex, a product of America's bloodiest conflict, whose violent path would be shaped by war, justified by myth, and ended by betrayal. To understand how a farmer's son from Clay County became the most celebrated criminal in American history, we must first understand the world that created him and the forces that would ultimately destroy him. Missouri in the mid-19th century stood as a powder keg waiting to explode. The state occupied a unique and precarious position in the years leading to the Civil War, straddling the border between North and South, between freedom and bondage, between two irreconcilable visions of America's future. It was a slave state, yes, but not fully committed to the peculiar institution in the way that the Deep South embraced it. This ambiguity, this fundamental division, would make Missouri one of the war's bloodiest theaters, a place where neighbor turned against neighbor, where the conflict became not just a political disagreement, but a deeply personal vendetta that would span generations. The James family embodied these contradictions perfectly. Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, into a prosperous farming family that owned 6 enslaved people. His father, Robert James, was a respected Baptist minister and hemp farmer, a man of education and ambition who had helped found William Jewell College. His mother, Zerelda Cole James, was a formidable woman whose fierce loyalty to her sons and to the Southern cause would become legendary. The young Jesse grew up in comfort, surrounded by the rolling fields and dense forests of western Missouri, in a world that seemed stable and permanent but was, in reality, teetering on the edge of catastrophe. The stability of Jesse's childhood shattered when his father departed for California in 1850, drawn by the promise of gold and the opportunity to preach to the miners flooding the western territories. Robert James never returned. He perished in the goldfields, leaving Zerelda a widow with 3 young children to raise. She remarried quickly, but the union was unhappy and brief. Her third marriage, to Dr. Reuben Samuel, proved more enduring. Samuel was a quiet, unassuming physician who would remain in Zerelda's shadow for the rest of his life, overshadowed by her domineering personality and her unwavering devotion to her sons. By the time Jesse reached adolescence, the nation was fracturing. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had ignited a brutal conflict in neighboring Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces waged a savage guerrilla war that would come to be known as Bleeding Kansas. This violence spilled across the border into western Missouri, where families like the Jameses, with their Southern sympathies and slaveholding interests, viewed the conflict through a lens of existential threat. When the Civil War officially began in 1861, Missouri attempted to remain neutral, but neutrality proved impossible. The state government fractured, with rival factions forming both Union and Confederate administrations. The regular armies of both sides marched through Missouri, but the real horror came from the irregular forces, the guerrilla bands that turned the state into a nightmare of ambush, reprisal, and atrocity. Jesse's older brother Frank was the first to join the fight. In 1863, at the age of 20, Frank James rode off to join the Confederate guerrillas, those irregular fighters who operated outside the conventional rules of warfare. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wore no uniforms, followed no military discipline, and recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians. The guerrilla war in Missouri was characterized by a savagery that shocked even veterans of conventional battles. Raids, ambushes, and massacres became routine. The guerrillas struck without warning, then melted back into the civilian population, relying on a network of Southern sympathizers for shelter and supplies. Union forces responded with brutal countermeasures, arresting suspected guerrilla supporters, confiscating property, and, in some cases, executing civilians without trial. The James family experienced this brutality firsthand. In 1863, Union militiamen came to the Samuel farm searching for Frank. Unable to find him, they tortured Dr. Samuel, attempting to hang him from a tree to force him to reveal his stepson's whereabouts. They beat Zerelda and, according to some accounts, mistreated the young Jesse. These experiences would be seared into the family's collective memory, becoming the foundation for a narrative of persecution that would later be used to justify Jesse's criminal career. The guerrillas whom Frank and later Jesse joined were not romantic freedom fighters. They were among the most violent and ruthless combatants the Civil War produced. The most infamous of these bands was led by William Clark Quantrill, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had adopted the Confederate cause and become one of the war's most feared guerrilla leaders. Quantrill's raiders operated throughout Missouri and Kansas, but their most notorious action came on August 21, 1863, when they descended upon Lawrence, Kansas, a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. In what would become known as the Lawrence Massacre, Quantrill's men spent 4 hours systematically executing every male they could find, ultimately taking the lives of approximately 150 unarmed civilians. They burned the town to the ground, looting homes and businesses before disappearing back into Missouri. Frank James was present at Lawrence, riding with Quantrill's command. The lessons learned there, the casual brutality, the complete disregard for civilian lives, and the effectiveness of surprise and overwhelming violence would shape the methods that Frank and Jesse would later employ as outlaws. Jesse was too young to participate in the Lawrence raid, but his time would come. In 1864, at barely 17 years old, he joined the guerrilla band led by William Bloody Bill Anderson, Quantrill's most savage lieutenant. Anderson was a psychopath who reportedly decorated his horse's bridle with the scalps of Union soldiers. His guerrillas specialized in particularly brutal tactics, and Jesse James, the teenage farm boy, proved himself willing and able to match their violence. The defining moment of Jesse's guerrilla career came on September 27, 1864, at Centralia, Missouri. Anderson's band, with Jesse James among them, stopped a train and discovered 25 unarmed Union soldiers on leave, still in uniform but carrying no weapons. Anderson's men forced the soldiers to strip naked, then systematically executed them. Only one man survived by pretending to be deceased. Hours later, when Union militia forces arrived in pursuit, Anderson's guerrillas ambushed them, routing a force 3 times their size. The young Jesse James participated in both atrocities, gaining a reputation among the guerrillas as a fearless and merciless fighter. This was the crucible in which Jesse James was forged. He came of age not on a farm or in a schoolhouse, but in a savage guerrilla war where violence was the only currency that mattered, where trust was a fatal weakness, and where the line between soldier and outlaw had long since ceased to exist. When the Civil War finally ended in April 1865, men like Jesse James faced an impossible situation. Unlike conventional soldiers who could return home with honor, guerrillas were viewed by Union authorities as criminals and terrorists. The surrender terms offered to regular Confederate forces did not automatically extend to the irregular fighters who had terrorized Missouri for 4 years. Many guerrillas, including Jesse James, attempted to surrender under the prevailing terms, but the process was chaotic and marked by suspicion and violence. According to the most commonly accepted account, Jesse was shot while attempting to surrender under a flag of truce in May 1865. The wound was severe, a bullet to the chest that punctured his lung and nearly ended his life. He was transported back to the family farm where his cousin Zerelda Mims, whom he would later marry, nursed him through months of painful recovery. The physical wound eventually healed, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. Jesse and his brother Frank, along with many other former guerrillas, emerged from the war feeling betrayed and persecuted. They had fought for what they believed was their homeland, their way of life, and their property, including the enslaved people who represented much of their family's wealth. Now that cause was lost, their world was shattered, and the victorious Union forces occupied their state. The transition from guerrilla fighter to outlaw was not a dramatic transformation for men like Jesse and Frank James. In many ways, it was simply a continuation of the same conflict by other means. The targets changed from Union soldiers and installations to banks and trains, but the methods remained the same: careful planning, overwhelming force, and swift escape. The justification shifted from defending the Confederacy to resisting what they portrayed as oppressive Yankee occupation. but the fundamental pattern of their lives remained unchanged. Violence was what they knew, and violence was what they would continue to practice. The first daylight bank robbery in peacetime American history occurred on February 13, 1866, in Liberty, Missouri, less than a year after the Civil War's end. 8 men rode into town during business hours, entered the Clay County Savings Association, and held the bank's employees at gunpoint. They made off with approximately $60,000, a staggering sum for the time. As they fled, one of the robbers shot and ended the life of a 19-year-old college student who happened to be in the street, a senseless act of violence that would characterize many of the gang's future robberies. While no one was immediately arrested, local authorities and many citizens suspected the James brothers and other former Quantrill guerrillas of being responsible. Over the next several years, a pattern emerged. Banks across Missouri and neighboring states were robbed by men who employed guerrilla tactics, striking during daylight hours with overwhelming force, then disappearing into a network of sympathetic farms and safe houses. In 1868, Jesse and Frank were definitively identified as participants in a bank robbery in Russellville, Kentucky, marking the first time Jesse's name appeared in connection with a specific crime. However, it was the robbery of the Daviess County Savings Association in Gallatin, Missouri, on December 7, 1869, that truly launched Jesse James into the public consciousness and set the pattern for his future notoriety. 3 men entered the bank in Gallatin, and Jesse James shot the cashier, a man named John Sheets, directly in the head without provocation or warning. According to Jesse's later claims, he believed Sheets was Samuel Cox, the Union militia officer who had been responsible for the demise of Bloody Bill Anderson in 1864. Whether Jesse genuinely mistook Sheets for Cox or simply fabricated the story later to justify a senseless execution remains unclear. What is certain is that Jesse had terminated an innocent man in cold blood, and the gang's escape from Gallatin was anything but smooth. As they fled, Jesse's horse fell, throwing him to the ground. He managed to climb onto his companion's horse, and the 2 men escaped riding double, leaving Jesse's horse behind. That abandoned horse proved to be a critical piece of evidence. It was quickly traced to the James family farm, and for the first time, authorities had concrete evidence linking Jesse and Frank to a specific robbery and a specific victim. Arrest warrants were issued, but the brothers had already gone to ground, protected by a network of former Confederate sympathizers who viewed them not as criminals but as heroes still fighting the war. It was at this point that Jesse James began to actively cultivate his public image, a process that would transform him from a common thief and individual who had ended lives into a romantic figure, a symbol of Southern resistance against Northern oppression. The architect of this transformation was John Newman Edwards, a former Confederate officer who had become the editor of the Kansas City Times. Edwards was a gifted writer and a committed lost cause ideologue who believed that the South had been unjustly defeated and that the post-war Reconstruction policies represented tyrannical Northern oppression. In Jesse James, Edwards saw the perfect hero for his narrative. He began publishing articles that portrayed Jesse and his gang not as robbers but as noble outlaws forced into a life of crime by vengeful Union authorities who would never allow former Confederates to live in peace. Edwards published letters, supposedly written by Jesse himself, eloquent defenses that proclaimed his innocence of specific crimes, while simultaneously boasting of his continued resistance to Northern tyranny. These letters and articles were masterworks of propaganda. They carefully constructed an image of Jesse James as a gentleman bandit, a man of honor who robbed only the wealthy banks and railroads that represented Northern capital and exploitation. The myth portrayed Jesse as a protector of common people, a Robin Hood figure who stood against the powerful on behalf of the powerless. This narrative resonated powerfully in post-war Missouri and throughout the former Confederacy, where many people felt genuinely oppressed by Reconstruction policies and Northern economic dominance. For these populations, Jesse James became a symbol of defiance, a man who refused to accept defeat, who continued to strike back at the hated Yankees even when the formal war had ended. The reality, of course, was far different from the myth. Jesse James was not a Robin Hood. There is no credible evidence that he ever gave stolen money to the poor. His robberies did not discriminate between Northern and Southern institutions. between rich and poor depositors. When the gang robbed a bank, they were stealing the hard-earned savings of farmers, shopkeepers, and working people, not just the profits of wealthy capitalists. When they derailed trains, they put innocent passengers at risk, and in several cases, those passengers were harmed or ended. During a robbery at the Kansas City Fair in 1872, a young girl was shot in the leg. When the gang derailed a train at Adair, Iowa, in 1873, the engineer, John Rafferty, perished in the crash. These victims were not wealthy oppressors. They were ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet the myth persisted and grew stronger with each passing year. Part of this was due to Edwards' skilled propaganda, but part of it was also due to genuine grievances that resonated with the myth's audience. Reconstruction policies were often harsh and sometimes corrupt. Former Confederates did face legal and economic discrimination. The railroads and banks that expanded across the West were frequently exploitative, charging exorbitant rates and foreclosing on struggling farmers. In this environment, Jesse James became a convenient symbol, a projection screen onto which people could project their frustrations and their fantasies of resistance. The man himself became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the story, and the story was powerful enough to survive any amount of contrary evidence. By the early 1872s, the James Gang had reached the height of its power and notoriety. The core of the gang consisted of Jesse and Frank James, along with the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, Bob, and John. These men were all former Confederate guerrillas, bound together by shared experiences of war and a network of family and friendship connections. They operated with ruthless efficiency, carefully scouting their targets, planning their escapes, and maintaining a network of safe houses and informants. They were aided by a culture of silence in rural Missouri, where many people, whether out of sympathy or fear, refused to cooperate with authorities seeking to capture the outlaws. The gang's success also attracted attention from law enforcement and private security forces. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, America's premier private investigation firm, was hired by banks and railroads to hunt down the James Gang. The Pinkertons pursued the outlaws with a determination that matched their own, but the campaign quickly descended into a cycle of violence and counter-violence that would have tragic consequences. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the Samuel family farm, believing that Jesse and Frank were hiding inside. The agents threw what they claimed was a flare device into the house to illuminate the interior. The device exploded with far more force than expected, tearing off Zerelda Samuel's right arm and ending the life of Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Archie. Whether the device was actually a bomb intended to eliminate the James brothers or truly a flare that exploded accidentally remains a matter of historical debate, but the incident had profound consequences. The bombing of the Samuel home transformed public opinion in Missouri. Even people who had been skeptical of Jesse James's Robin Hood image were outraged by what appeared to be a deliberate attack on an innocent woman and child. The Missouri legislature actually considered a bill that would have granted amnesty to the James and younger brothers, though it ultimately failed to pass. The incident reinforced the narrative of persecution that Edwards and Jesse had been promoting for years. Here was apparent proof that the authorities were willing to employ any means, however brutal, to eliminate men who had simply been defending their homeland during the war. Yet even as the gang's legend grew, the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Law enforcement pressure was intensifying, the network of sympathizers was slowly eroding, and internal tensions within the gang were beginning to surface. The men were growing older, some were starting families, and the romantic life of the outlaw was revealing itself to be one of constant flight, paranoid vigilance, and inevitable violent confrontation. The beginning of the end came on September 7, 1876, in Northfield, Minnesota, 400 miles from their Missouri stronghold, when the James Younger gang attempted what they believed would be their most lucrative robbery yet. The decision to target the First National Bank of Northfield was driven by several factors. The gang believed the bank held substantial deposits, making it an attractive target. Moreover, there was a personal element to the choice. The bank was associated with two former Union generals and radical Republican politicians, Adelbert Ames and his father-in-law Benjamin Butler. Ames had recently served as Reconstruction Governor of Mississippi, where he had vigorously supported civil rights for formerly enslaved people, making him a hated figure among former Confederates. Cole Younger later claimed they selected the bank specifically because of its connection to Ames, framing the robbery as an act of political vengeance rather than simple theft. 8 men rode into Northfield on that September afternoon. The gang included Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, along with Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell. They had spent the previous days scouting the town and surrounding area, purchasing expensive horses and mapping out escape routes. Their plan was a standard James Younger operation. A portion of the gang would enter the bank while the others stood guard outside, controlling the street and covering the escape route. However, from the beginning, the Northfield raid went catastrophically wrong. 3 men entered the bank around 2 o'clock in the afternoon: Bob Younger, Frank James, and Charlie Pitts. Inside were 3 bank employees, including the acting cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood. The robbers vaulted over the counter and ordered Haywood to open the safe. This is where the robbery began to unravel. Haywood, displaying extraordinary courage, insisted that the safe was equipped with a time lock and could not be opened. This was a lie. The safe was actually unlocked, but the robbers, perhaps unfamiliar with the relatively new technology of time locks, accepted Haywood's assertion. As they tried to intimidate him with threats and a knife held to his throat, one of the other employees, Alonzo Bunker, attempted to flee through the back door. The robbers shot him in the shoulder, but he managed to escape and sound the alarm. Outside, the scene was descending into chaos. A local merchant named J.S. Allen had observed the suspicious behavior of the men guarding the street and realized a robbery was in progress. He began shouting the alarm, rallying the townspeople. The citizens of Northfield, unlike the rural Missourians the gang was accustomed to robbing, did not panic and flee. Instead, they armed themselves and began shooting at the outlaws from windows and doorways. The gang members outside tried to control the street by firing their weapons and shouting threats, but they were rapidly becoming surrounded. What followed was 7 minutes of intense urban combat. Henry Wheeler, a 19-year-old medical student, grabbed an old army carbine and positioned himself in a hotel window overlooking the street. He shot Clell Miller through the heart, ending his life instantly. Anselm Manning, the owner of a hardware store who had his own money deposited in the bank, seized a breech-loading Remington rifle and opened fire. He shot Bill Chadwell, peppering his body with bullets and leaving him deceased in the street. Manning also wounded Cole Younger in the shoulder. The gang members were being cut down by citizens who had transformed themselves into an impromptu militia. Inside the bank, the situation was equally desperate. The robbers realized they needed to escape immediately, but as a final act of vindictive rage, one of them shot Joseph Haywood in the head, ending the brave cashier's life for his refusal to cooperate. The 3 men burst from the bank to find 2 of their comrades deceased in the street, and the others desperately trying to fight their way out of town. Bob Younger's horse had been shot from under him, and his elbow was shattered by a bullet. Cole Younger, despite his own wound, helped his brother onto another horse. Frank James was hit in the leg. The gang fled south with only $26.70 for their trouble, leaving $15,000 untouched in the supposedly locked safe. The aftermath of the Northfield disaster was catastrophic for the gang. Every remaining member had been wounded. They had lost a third of their force, and they were now being pursued through unfamiliar territory by hundreds of armed citizens and law enforcement officers. It became the largest manhunt in American history to that point, with rewards totaling thousands of dollars for the capture of the outlaws. For 2 weeks, the gang fled through the forests and swamps of southern Minnesota, leaving a trail that pursuers could easily follow. Exhausted, wounded, and increasingly desperate, the gang split up. Jesse and Frank, the most experienced guerrillas, managed to secure fresh horses and eventually made their way back to Missouri. The younger brothers and Charlie Pitts, less fortunate, were cornered near Madelia, Minnesota, on September 21st. The final confrontation was brief but bloody. Charlie Pitts was eliminated in the gunfight, and the 3 younger brothers, all severely wounded, surrendered. They were transported to jail, tried, and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Minnesota State Prison. The James Younger gang, which had terrorized the Midwest for a decade, was effectively destroyed. Only Frank and Jesse James remained free, and their lives as outlaws would never be the same. For the next 3 years, Frank and Jesse James essentially retired from crime. Both men, using assumed names, moved to Tennessee with their wives. Jesse had married his cousin Zerelda Mims in 1874, and the couple had 2 children. For a time, it seemed that Jesse might actually succeed in living a quiet, respectable life. He attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and was known to his Tennessee neighbors as a quiet, friendly man named J.D. Howard. Frank, living nearby under his own alias, seemed similarly content to leave his outlaw past behind, but Jesse James was constitutionally incapable of remaining idle. Whether driven by financial need, boredom, a craving for notoriety, or simply an inability to function outside the violent world he had known since adolescence, Jesse began planning a return to crime in 1879. However, the world had changed during his absence. His old comrades were deceased, imprisoned, or had genuinely reformed. The network of Southern sympathizers that had protected him was eroding as memories of the war faded and new generations came of age. Law enforcement techniques had improved, and public tolerance for outlawry was declining. Nevertheless, Jesse assembled a new gang, recruiting men who lacked the guerrilla experience and deep loyalty of his previous associates. These were men attracted by the prospect of easy money, not ideological comrades bound by shared wartime experiences. The new gang's first significant robbery occurred in October 1879, when they held up a train near Glendale, Missouri, making off with approximately $35,000. Several more train robberies followed over the next 2 years, but the operations were sloppier than the meticulously planned jobs of the old gang. Law enforcement was closing in, and internal tensions within the new gang were growing. Jesse, always paranoid, became increasingly suspicious of his own men, correctly suspecting that some were considering betrayal. He confronted and reportedly ended Ed Miller, whom he suspected of being an informant. He drove away Jim Cummins after growing suspicious of his loyalty. The gang was fragmenting from within even as external pressure intensified. By 1881, Jesse was a marked man in every sense. Missouri had elected a new governor, Thomas Crittenden, who made the elimination of the James gang a personal priority. Crittenden, a former Union officer, had no sympathy for the lost cause mythology that surrounded Jesse James. He persuaded railroad and express companies to pool their resources and offer a reward of $10,000 for the capture of Jesse or Frank James, deceased or alive. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern terms, and it represented a powerful temptation for anyone close to the Outlaws. Jesse moved his family to St. Joseph, Missouri, in November 1881, renting a small house on a hill overlooking the city. He lived under the name Thomas Howard, presenting himself as a cattle buyer. His wife, Z, and their 2 children accompanied him, and to their neighbors, they appeared to be an ordinary, somewhat reclusive family. Jesse attended the local church, but did not seek employment, raising some quiet questions about how Mr. Howard supported his family. Despite his efforts at anonymity, Jesse was planning one more robbery. His gang had been reduced to just 2 members he felt he could trust. The Ford brothers, Charlie and Bob. Robert Newton Ford was 21 years old in 1882. A small, unremarkable young man who had worshipped Jesse James from afar and had finally achieved his dream of joining the legendary Outlaws gang. However, Bob Ford was also ambitious, greedy, and calculating. He understood that the era of the outlaw was ending, and that Jesse James, far from being the path to fortune and glory, was actually a liability, a hunted man whose associates would inevitably share his fate. When Bob learned of the massive reward offered by Governor Crittenden, he saw an opportunity to achieve wealth and notoriety through a different means. In January 1882, another gang member, Dick Liddell, got into a violent altercation with Jesse's cousin, Wood Height, while they were hiding in the home of Martha Bolton, who happened to be the sister of Bob and Charlie Ford. During the confrontation, both men drew weapons and fired. The wounds were superficial, but Bob Ford, present during the incident, seized a moment of opportunity and shot Height in the head, ending his life. Now Ford had a serious problem. He had terminated Jesse James's cousin, and there was no way to conceal the body that would not eventually raise Jesse's suspicions. Ford made a calculated decision. He surrendered to authorities and met secretly with Governor Crittenden. The governor made Ford an offer. In exchange for bringing Jesse James to justice, Ford would receive a full pardon for any crimes he had committed, including the ending of Woodhite, and he would receive the substantial reward money. Ford accepted without hesitation. He and his brother Charlie, who was brought into the conspiracy, would continue to pose as loyal gang members while waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. For the next 2 months, the Ford brothers lived with Jesse and his family at the house in Street Joseph, ostensibly planning a robbery of a bank in Platte City, Missouri. Jesse, despite his legendary paranoia, seemed to trust the Fords, or at least trust them more than anyone else available to him. However, as the days passed, signs of suspicion began to emerge. Jesse sometimes separated the brothers, not allowing them to speak privately. He would watch them carefully, his hand never far from his weapons. Yet he also made gestures of friendship, at one point giving Bob a new nickel-plated revolver as a gift. On the morning of April 3rd, 1882, the three men had breakfast together, and Jesse read the morning newspaper. An article in the paper reported the arrest and confession of Dick Liddell regarding the demise of Woodhite. Jesse must have realized in that moment that the Fords had been withholding crucial information from him, information that directly concerned the fate of his cousin, yet he did not confront them. Whether he suspected their betrayal and decided to test them, whether he was simply too weary to care, or whether some part of him actually welcomed the end that was coming, remains one of history's enduring mysteries. After breakfast, Jesse stood up and removed his gun belt, an action he almost never took when others were present. He placed his 2 revolvers on the sofa. Then he walked across the living room to a wall where a dusty picture hung crooked on its frame. He stepped onto a chair to straighten and dust the picture, turning his back to the Ford brothers. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Bob Ford drew the nickel-plated revolver that Jesse had given him, aimed carefully at the back of Jesse's head, and fired once. The bullet struck Jesse just behind the right ear, and he fell from the chair, deceased before his body hit the floor. He was 34 years old. His 16-year career as America's most notorious outlaw had ended in the most ignominious way possible, shot in the back by a trusted associate in his own home while performing a domestic chore. The Ford brothers immediately fled the house, running down the street shouting their accomplishment. Bob Ford reportedly called out, "I shot him! I killed Jesse James!" They quickly surrendered to authorities, expecting to be hailed as heroes. However, the public reaction was far different from what they anticipated. While there was certainly relief that Jesse James could no longer terrorize the Midwest, there was also widespread revulsion at the manner of his demise. Bob Ford had shot an unarmed man in the back, in his own home, after accepting his hospitality and trust. This was not the act of a hero. It was the act of a coward and a traitor. The Ford brothers were promptly charged with first-degree termination and sentenced to hang. However, Governor Crittenden kept his promise. Within hours of their sentencing, he issued full pardons to both men and arranged for them to receive a portion of the reward money. The governor's apparent conspiracy to facilitate the demise of a private citizen, even an outlaw, outraged many Missourians and transformed Jesse James, in death, into an even more powerful symbol than he had been in life. The image of the betrayed outlaw, shot down by a treacherous friend, perfectly reinforced the martyrdom narrative that John Newman Edwards and others had been constructing for years. Jesse James's body was put on display at a local undertaker's establishment, where thousands of people filed past to view the notorious outlaw. His mother, Zerelda Samuel, traveled to Street Joseph to claim her son's remains. She would spend the rest of her long life, she died in 1911, cultivating the Jesse James legend, giving tours of the family farm, and showing visitors her son's grave. She never wavered in her insistence that Jesse had been a noble man, driven to outlawry by persecution, a victim rather than a perpetrator of violence. The funeral was held in Kearney, Missouri, and Jesse was initially buried on the family farm, under a coffee bean tree where his mother could watch over his grave from the house. The marker she erected bore a bitter epitaph, reflecting her version of history and her enduring rage at those she held responsible for her son's fate. In 1902, Jesse's remains were moved to Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, where they rest to this day, though not without controversy. Over the years, numerous individuals claimed to be Jesse James, insisting that someone else had been shot in Street Joseph, and that the real Jesse had escaped to live a quiet life elsewhere. These claims persisted until 1995, when forensic scientists exhumed the body buried as Jesse James and conducted DNA testing. The results confirmed, with 99.7% certainty, that the remains were indeed those of Jesse Woodson James. As for Bob Ford, the end of Jesse James brought him none of the glory he had sought. He attempted to capitalize on his notoriety by posing for photographs and appearing in stage shows that reenacted Jesse's demise, but he was widely reviled as a traitor. A popular ballad of the time, the Ballad of Jesse James, immortalized him in the most unflattering terms possible. "That dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave." Charlie Ford, tormented by guilt and afflicted with tuberculosis, took his own life in 1884. Bob drifted west, eventually opening a saloon in Creede, Colorado. On June 8, 1892, a man named Edward O'Kelly walked into Ford's saloon and shot him in the throat with a shotgun, reportedly saying, "That's for Jesse James." Bob Ford was 30 years old. Even in demise, he could not escape the shadow of the man he had ended. Frank James, learning of his brother's fate, faced a critical decision. He could continue running, living as a fugitive for the rest of his life, or he could take a different path. In October 1882, 7 months after Jesse's demise, Frank James made an extraordinary choice. He negotiated a surrender directly with Governor Crittenden, walked into the governor's office in Jefferson City, Missouri, and handed over his weapons. He was tried for robbery and for the termination of several individuals, but in a series of sensational trials, he was acquitted by juries that seemed unwilling to convict the last of the James brothers. Frank lived the remaining 33 years of his life as a law-abiding citizen. He worked various jobs, including a stint as a race starter at county fairs, and he occasionally appeared with Cole Younger, released from prison in 1901, in a Wild West show. Frank James passed away peacefully in 1915, at the age of 72, on the same farm where he and Jesse had grown up. Having survived his brother by 33 years, and having successfully made the transition from outlaw to ordinary citizen that Jesse had proven incapable of making. The legend of Jesse James, however, did not die with the man or fade with the passing years. Instead, it grew stronger, fed by dime, novels, newspaper accounts, and eventually by films, television shows, and countless books. The Jesse James of popular culture bore little resemblance to the historical figure. He was transformed into a noble rebel, a wronged man forced into a life of crime, a champion of the common people against wealthy oppressors. This mythical Jesse James has proven remarkably durable, surviving mountains of historical evidence that contradicts it. The reality is far more complex and far less heroic. Jesse James was a product of America's most traumatic conflict, a teenager who learned violence during a savage guerrilla war and never successfully transitioned to peace. He was not driven to crime by persecution. The guerrillas who became outlaws after the Civil War had genuine opportunities to rebuild their lives. Many former Confederate soldiers and even former guerrillas successfully reintegrated into society. Jesse James chose outlawry because it was what he knew, what he was good at, and perhaps because some part of him enjoyed it. His robberies did not discriminate between rich and poor, between northern and southern institutions. When banks were robbed, ordinary depositors lost their savings. When trains were derailed, ordinary workers perished or suffered terrible injuries. There is no credible evidence that Jesse James ever distributed stolen money to the poor, or that he selected his targets based on any principle beyond their vulnerability and the expected payoff. Yet the myth persists because it serves powerful psychological and cultural needs. For white Southerners after the Civil War, Jesse James became a symbol of resistance to what they perceived as Northern oppression and cultural domination. The Lost Cause ideology, which portrayed the Confederacy as noble and heroic rather than as a rebellion in defense of human bondage, needed heroes, and Jesse James fit the bill perfectly. He was the man who refused to accept defeat, who continued fighting even when the formal war had ended. The fact that his fight consisted primarily of robbing banks and trains was conveniently overlooked in favor of a more romantic narrative. For a broader American audience, Jesse James represented something equally powerful: the individual standing against institutions, the frontier spirit refusing to submit to civilization, the romantic outlaw who lived by his own code. This archetype has deep roots in American culture, from Robin Hood stories imported from Britain to homegrown legends of frontier individualism. Jesse James became the template for countless fictional outlaws who would follow him in popular culture, from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to Bonnie and Clyde to modern anti-heroes in film and television. The transformation of Jesse James from violent criminal to folk hero reveals much about how we construct our myths and what we choose to remember. The uncomfortable truths, the innocent victims, the casual brutality, the self-serving justifications, these tend to be forgotten or minimized. What remains is the compelling story, the daring robberies, the narrow escapes, the romantic outlaw and his gang, the tragic end by betrayal. This is the Jesse James who lives in our collective imagination. And this Jesse James, however historically inaccurate, has become more real to most people than the actual man who lived and robbed and ended lives, and was ultimately shot down in his own home. The historical Jesse James was neither a hero nor a simple villain. He was a man shaped by extraordinary circumstances, the violence of the Civil War and its bloody guerrilla campaigns, who proved unable or unwilling to leave that violence behind when the war ended. He was capable of extraordinary courage and equally extraordinary cruelty. He was devoted to his family and utterly ruthless toward his victims. He cultivated a public image of himself as a persecuted innocent, while simultaneously boasting of his exploits. He inspired fierce loyalty in some, and equally fierce hatred in others. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the Jesse James story is not the man himself, but what we have made of him. The legend of Jesse James tells us as much about ourselves, about our values, our fantasies, and our need for heroes, as it does about a Missouri outlaw who died more than a century ago. We want our outlaws to be noble, our rebels to be righteous, our violence to have meaning and purpose. Jesse James, in reality, offered none of these things, but in myth, he offers all of them. The house in Street Joseph, where Jesse James perished, still stands, preserved as a museum. Thousands of visitors tour it each year, standing in the room where Bob Ford fired the fatal shot, viewing the furniture and possessions that once belonged to the James family. The coffee bean tree under which Jesse was first buried on the family farm is long gone, but visitors still come to the farm, now also a museum, to walk the same ground where the James brothers grew up. The grave in Mount Olivet Cemetery receives a steady stream of visitors, some leaving flowers, some leaving coins in an old tradition honoring the departed. These pilgrimages to the sites associated with Jesse James are not really about the historical figure. They are about the myth, about connecting with a story that has become part of American folklore. Jesse James has transcended history to become a symbol, and symbols, unlike men, cannot be ended by a bullet to the back of the head. The symbol lives on, shape-shifting with each generation, adapting to new cultural needs and new political contexts, but always retaining its essential core. The outlaw as hero, the rebel who will not submit, the man who chose freedom and danger over safety and submission. What really happened to Jesse James is a question with two very different answers. The historical answer is clear. He was shot and ended by Bob Ford in Street Joseph, Missouri, on April 3, 1882, ending a 16-year career of robbery and violence that had terrorized the Midwest and captured the American imagination. But the mythological answer is equally clear. Jesse James did not truly pass away in that little house on the hill. He was transformed, elevated from a hunted criminal to an immortal legend, a figure who represents something fundamental in the American psyche. The real Jesse James was a violent man who robbed banks, derailed trains, and bore responsibility for numerous casualties. He was not a hero. He was not a champion of the oppressed. He was a product of war who became an outlaw, and who met a violent end that was, in many ways, inevitable given the life he had chosen. Yet knowing this historical truth has done nothing to diminish the power of the Jesse James myth. The legend has proven stronger than reality, more compelling than facts, more enduring than truth. Perhaps that is the ultimate irony of the Jesse James story. The man who spent his life cultivating a false image, who used propaganda and myth to justify his crimes, who consciously constructed himself as a persecuted hero rather than a common criminal, succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The image he created has outlived not only the man himself but also the memory of his victims, the truth of his crimes, and the judgment of history. Jesse James, in death, achieved what he had always sought in life: immortality, fame, and a place in the American pantheon of heroes, however undeserved that place might be. The dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard has indeed laid Jesse in his grave, but the ghost that rose from that grave has haunted American culture for more than a century and shows no sign of fading. The man became a myth, and the myth became, in its own way, more real than the man ever was. That transformation, from outlaw to icon, from criminal to legend, is what really happened to Jesse James, and it is a story that tells us as much about ourselves as it does about him.